So let's start with designated agency. Jeff, can you explain to us what is a situation that could arise that would call for a designated agency relationship?
Sure. In both cases, and we're going to spend a couple minutes on designated agency, but in both cases of designated or dual agency, these situations only arise when buyer, seller, agent, property are within the same office. Okay, if you spend your real estate career co-broking with a competitor across town, you sell their stuff, they sell your stuff, then these cases of modified agency, really, either designated or dual, never really show up. So it's important to note that right off the bat. You can't practice designated agency with your competitor across town, nor dual agency. They only arise when the entire transaction is within the same office. By the way, designated is sometimes known as appointed agency. I know in the state of Maine it's appointed agency, and that may be the case in other states as well. But that's a case where a buyer and a seller in property are within the same office, and the broker of that office, the mechanics of it are, the broker in that office appoints one agent to represent the buyer. They appoint another agent to represent the seller. Oftentimes, the seller agent is already established. I mean, that's how our business works, isn't it? The listing is created, and a buyer shows up interested in that listing. So usually the buyer is the second part to the party. So in a designated agency office, the buyer expressing interest on that property that's listed with the same office, the broker appoints each agent, separate agent, one to work with the buyer, one to work with the seller. Each are allowed to practice the full old car fiduciary set of duties with their respective clients, but they are the only agent in the office entitled to do that, to keep those confidences, to fully follow the fiduciary duties on buyer and seller. Now, that sounds, at least when I first heard the concept as a day-to-day practitioner, I thought, well, why isn't everyone doing that? That seems to make a lot of sense. But as they say, the devil can sometimes be in the details. For example, what does that make then the broker of the office, the person in charge of the office, when they appoint one of their agents representing the seller, one of their agents representing the buyer? It creates a dual agency situation for that broker. So the existence of a policy in an office where designated agency is the way that we practice in these situations does not mean dual agency never shows up. The other complication can be we have one agent representing a buyer and a seller in an office. If that office does not practice dual agency per se, and I'm already getting into dual agency ahead of myself, then another agent in the office will need to be found for that buyer or seller, one or the other. If the office does practice dual agency, well, then that agent can do that. But that agent cannot be that one agent working with a buyer and seller on the same property cannot, just due to common sense, fully represent both parties at the same time.
And I want to point out too that in a single agency relationship, so just straight buyer agency, seller agency, it's not just the individual or you, the licensee, who represents that buyer. It's everyone in your office.
Everyone in the office.
So designated agency says, look, it's not everyone in the office anymore. It's the broker saying it's your client as whoever's working with the buyer. You are going to continue to work with the buyer. And if the other party, the seller, is also in-house with another agent, then that person is going to stay with it. It doesn't come around. It doesn't occur when the broker says, oh, okay, this is your listing. Well, John, he hasn't had a listing in a while, so he's going to take over. It's usually just saying, here are your roles. You get to continue to play your own roles, but the relationship is a little bit different now in that it's scoped specifically to those the buyer and that agent's relationship and the seller and that agent's relationship. And the broker really remains as like a neutral third party. They are effectively acting as dual agents, so they can't listen to both parties' problems and try to necessarily solve them. That's up to the agents. It's up to them to provide any sort of just general transactional support as to next steps, how things work, not advising or picking a side on who to favor.
2 items of note on designated agency. Number one, it's an option in most states. And individual offices, not individual branches of offices, individual offices. If an office has 20 branches, they're either opt-in or they opt-out as a group. Can't vary branch to branch. But it is a choice. So as a choice, that office would incorporate it as part of their office policy. So it's a choice, has to be memorialized via some sort of written office policy to that effect. And that's really important. And secondly, to create those relationships, that designated buyer agent, designated seller agent, there needs to be additional paperwork executed between the agent and their respective clients, acknowledging that we are now in a designated agency or appointed agency relationship. What does that mean in terms of office atmosphere? It means a couple things. A, that client needs to be Mirandized, expression Jeff used earlier, to make sure when they're in the office and their agent isn't there, that they don't start talking to the agent at the desk or the agent that's hanging around about their situation and so on, because that is revealing possibly confidential information to someone who isn't their designated agent. That's important. That's key. Number 2, files in offices of practice designated agency oftentimes are very closely managed, i.e., the agent representing the buyer can't get into the listing file. The agent working with the seller can't get into the buyer agent file. And oftentimes those files are on lockdown. The agents walk around with, skeletal copies of files with pertinent data, but the central file is oftentimes on lockdown. So all this can be done. And in fact, designated, i.e. appointed agency, is a very common practice in our industry. But looking at it again from the outside, when I began this segment, it looks easy. Why doesn't everyone do it? But once you understand the office policies and procedures that need to travel with it, it becomes a little more complex. But it's still a great way to represent buyers and sellers.
When we started this segment, you mentioned how if you constantly work with a broker on the other side of town, a different brokerage, you're competing brokerages, it's difficult to find yourself in either a designated or dual agency situation. Much more commonly, if you work for a very large brokerage firm or a firm that has a number of branches across the city or maybe spread out in an entire region of the state that are all owned and operated by the same brokerage, and there's an important distinction there in that they have to be all operated by the same brokerage. So if it's a franchise, if ABC Real Estate is operated by Jeff Chute over on one side of town, and then there's another franchisee that operates an ABC brokerage on the other side of town, those are 2 separate brokerages. While they have the same name, that is not the same brokerage. So that would not be considered a designated or dual agency situation. However, if ABC brokerage, if there was 10 different branches all owned and under the umbrella of the same broker, that would be considered a designated or dual agency situation. And that this commonly happens in the larger brokerages that they focus on a specific area, specific neighborhoods, towns, et cetera, depending on their size. And they get a lot of activity on both sides, so on the seller side and the buyer side. So they'll have their for sale signs, you'll see them all across town, and the buyers will just naturally filter towards calling the people that they seem most familiar with. And that's not always the case, but those are the situations that will arise where you'll probably have a designated or dual agent situation, and sometimes you don't even realize it because you were talking to, Jeff over at ABC Brokerage on this side of town. You want to see a listing on this side of town by another branch location. And in that case, you're now in a designated, at the least, a designated agency relationship scenario because it's the same office, the same parties in the same office. It's the same property. Everything is in the same under the same roof, and that's designated agency. So when you're providing your clients with an agency disclosure form at the beginning of your relationship, you're likely going to be providing them with a single agency relationship form, or at least the checkbox is checked off that represents single agency, unless they come to you with a specific property and you know up front that it's going to be an in-house listing, because then you would choose either probably the designated or dual if that's permissible where you operate. So it's also possible that you start off in a single agency relationship and you realize your client is interested in pursuing a property that's a listing that's also in your brokerage. And at that time, when your agency relationship changes, you need to provide a follow-on agency disclosure form with the correct boxes checked, letting your client know for their protection how the agency relationship between the brokerage, you, the licensee, and the client has changed. Because the last thing that you want is to get yourself in trouble for not clearly outlining your scope, your role, your brokerage's role, and then have your client end up feeling like they were somehow misrepresented, it wasn't their best interests, etc. So that's how we get from single agency to designated agency. And dual agency, or in one state, as I was reviewing our agency disclosures that I printed out from various states, it's actually considered to be more of an intermediary, and they're not the exact same, but it's a close similarity. So if in your state you have what's called an intermediary, that's close to dual agency. But let's focus on dual agency. Jeff, how does dual agency arise?
Well, the foundation for creation of dual agency is the same as creation of designated agency, and that is buyer-seller property, all within the same office. If it's a multiple office operation, it doesn't matter. The buyer comes from one office, the seller from the other, it doesn't matter. It's still within the same office. And again, office policies will dictate it. But essentially, dual agency, buyer and seller go to a dual agency relationship, and essentially the agents working with the respective parties end up limiting their fiduciary duties, in particular the area of advocacy. There are a number of definitions of dual agency that spell out specifically what the agent can and cannot do, but in the area of advocacy, the area of negotiation. Now, a contrarian would argue, well, isn't that one of the most important jobs we do? Well, maybe so, depending on the client and the situation, but advocacy. So when a buyer says, okay, I'd like to know what I should offer on this property in terms of price, you're somewhat limited to saying words to the effect of I've provided you with recently sold comparables. You're going to have to decide what price to offer on your own in this case. And in negotiations, so how should I counteroffer? What can I do to sweeten the pot? What language changes can I make, or what should I change? I need to change what the seller has counter-proposed. How should I do that? Our advocacy goes away. The other peripheral things stay the same. Confidentiality for the most part, loyalty for the most part. Accounting certainly is an easy one, reasonable care. But advocacy is the one area that does change in dual agency. So just like Jeff outlined before, our paper trail into dual agency generally starts with the disclosure of real estate options that we talked about right at the beginning. It's not a contract, it's a disclosure. Then proceeding from there into some kind of exclusive agency contract, be they buyer or seller. And oftentimes those contracts, depending on how and who drafted them, may have provisions in them already saying this office practices designated agency, this office practices dual agency. And so we're just allowing for that possibility, but then finally followed up with an item of paperwork that says, okay, we're in this case, dual agency. Here's what it is. We're all signing on to it and obtaining signatures at that point. So dual agency is a great way to have buyer and seller in the same office, but it does limit the skill set and the fiduciary duties that an agent can offer. It augments, if you will. We had a set, we were following them fully. Now we're going to dual agency, so that set gets augmented in certain ways.
So I want to give a real life example of a time that I actually found myself in a dual agency position. And just to say what everyone should be thinking is, wow, you made twice the commission, and the answer is yes. But I will say I didn't necessarily enjoy the interactions and relationships that I had with the client. So here's how it happened. I had listed a condo for sale, and I was working with the seller. We had talked about all the strategies, the different options that they had. We had hosted a couple open houses together, and then just one of the open houses, a buyer comes through, unrepresented, decides they want to purchase the home. And I said, well, are you working with an agent? No. Okay, well, I'd be happy to work with you on this, but it requires informed consent. So and I explained how a traditional real estate transaction works, in that usually there's one licensee representing one side and one representing the other. And in this scenario, I said I would be open to it if you are open to it. And they said that they were. So then I went back to the seller and I said, look, we found a buyer. The buyer's unrepresented. If it's okay with you, I'd love to do a dual agency situation. It's my first time doing it. I knew how to do it. I've taught how to do it. I had never put it into actual practice. So it was a slightly exciting time, not just for the additional compensation that I received, but be able to actually do it. And I told both of them from the moment that they signed. So dual agency requires informed consent. Informed consent means another disclosure form that says, here is the buyer, here is the seller. The brokerage, the agent, is going to be representing both at the same time. And as you've referred to in another course, the scope of effectiveness is severely limited to what me, the real estate licensee, can provide to both sides. Now, as previously being loyal and committed to the seller, I was comfortable and confident that the seller knew exactly what to do from that point forward. There were very few things that we had left stones unturned with regard to things that could come up in next steps, because early on in the process, I had educated and talked through everything on the seller side. The buyer side, this was not the first property that they had purchased. They were pretty competent on their own, and I explained to them that, look, we normally, in a normal agency relationship, I would be, guiding you on everything from price to different terms, to potentially proposing different time frames based on what I thought would be best. But I couldn't do this without the express permission of the seller, because I now have confidential information that I would be receiving from both sides, right? Because in every scenario, this always happens, dual agency or not, a buyer or their agent's going to be like, oh, how firm are they on the price? Are they flexible at all? How people answer that question, how real estate licensees respond to that is up to you. What you're allowed to say versus what you are approved from your client to share is also, changes from transaction to transaction. But I told them I wouldn't be able to help them through. I'd be acting more as sort of a neutral third party, guiding them both through the process at a process level, not at an advocacy level. So I'd make sure that the right forms were signed. I'd make sure that the monies were where they needed to be. I'd make sure that they were communicating with the right people at the right time, to make sure that we stayed all essentially rowing in the same direction towards the finish line. But once the dual agency form was signed, I had to just sort of bite my tongue. There were times where I wanted to say something, and I was like, I can't do it. I can't make it easier on one party or the other. I can't favor one side or the other, even if I had previously talked. So because I had prepared the seller for a lot of the different scenarios, I knew that if they asked me a question and we had discussed it previously, I'd tell them, look, I can't tell you any more than I've already told you, which was before we engaged in dual agency. And for that reason, I didn't love it, because I wasn't really able to fully advocate, right? Or advocate at all for one side or the other through the transaction. Now, it was a nice size check at the end of the day, but for me, it was a difficult and very thin ice to walk on to make sure that I stayed neutral through the remainder of the transaction. It turned out working out well. Both clients had a good experience, but as soon as you favor one side or the other, boom, that's your fiduciary duties that you owe to one or the other, or your dual agency duties that you now owe. You'd be violating those, and it could adversely affect the outcome of that transaction, and that could, hopefully it won't, but it could filter back to you, and through vicarious liability, which we discussed earlier, back to your broker as well. So dual agency, while permissible in many states, is not necessarily allowed at the office level, at the brokerage level. So some brokerages will say, no, we don't do this, it's too risky. However, there are other brokerages that actually market their ability to perform dual and designated agency. They say, last year we did the most number of in-house listings, which means we bought the buyer and the seller together. We did a lot of off-market listings, and in some markets, in some scenarios, that's advantageous to your clients. And the challenge that you have with dual agency when you're just sort of blanketed saying, we do the most, we're great at it, et cetera, is that everyone in your office needs to understand this topic to the T. Because if anyone in your office slips up, it's on you, and it's also signals that there might be a larger issue around training and the understanding of how restrictive designated and more specifically dual agency is to those real estate licensees that operate in that office. And as we are filming this now, there is a very large lawsuit going on in New England against a large firm that practices and markets their ability for dual agency, for in-house listings, saying we have the most buyers, we bring the most, so we put the most deals in-house together. And the problem, as I understand it, is that not that they weren't disclosing this, because they were getting all the forms signed, but they weren't acting in the ways that they were supposed to act. So it's not what's on the paper that's signed, it's the way that your actions are. Just because you've got that agency relationship disclosure signed, just because you go so far as to have the dual agency agreement signed by both parties, it doesn't give you the ability to act however you'd like, right? Because the forms are just outlining for the consumer's benefit how things will operate from that point forward. But the brokerage that's the complaints against, or the lawsuit is against, apparently or allegedly, were not acting as dual agents, even though they said they were. They were still favoring one party over the other. So just because you have documentation signed and maybe your clients understand it, it doesn't give you the ability to act in ways that you are not supposed to. So designated agency, I'd say it's pretty easy to operate in that format. Dual agency can be very tricky. It can be very straightforward. You want to make sure not only that your clients sign these forms, but that they understand them, because the last thing that you want to happen is for your seller client, who you've been working with for the past month and had many conversations and open houses with, to sign a form, not realize what they're signing, find out you can no longer really fully represent them in the way that you had previously. It just turns into a less than desirable situation and relationship. And ultimately, as everyone says, referrals are your greatest source of business. You're less likely to get referrals if you're treating your clients in ways that they don't appreciate or that they don't realize. So that's our segment on designated versus dual agency.